Mr. Robert Shenk. The subject will be the United States Navy and Pontos, 1919 to 1923. Mr. Robert Shenk is Professor of English and Coordinator of Graduate Studies, Department of English, University of New Orleans, with a PhD in English from the University of Kansas. He is the author of America's Black Sea Fleet, the U.S. Navy Amidst War and Revolution, the Naval Institute Guide to Naval Writing, editor of Playships of the World, the Naval Diaries of Admiral Dan Gallery, 1919 to 1924, co-author with C. Herbert Gilliland, Admiral Dan Gallery, The Life and Wit of a Naval Original. Editor, authors at sea, Modern American Writers Remember the Naval Service. Editor, The Left-Handed Monkey Wrench, Stories and Essays by Richard McKenna. His naval background includes retired captain, United States Naval Reserve. As a Naval Reserve Commander, he taught in the Department of English, U.S. Air Force Academy, 1979 to 82, and in the Department of English, U.S. Naval Academy, 1982 to 1985. He served as Communications Officer on the USS Harry E. Hubbard, 1966 to 68. His service included 2 deployments to the South China Sea. He served as Senior Patrol Officer, River Division 535, on the Mekong River and small rivers and canals in South Vietnam from 88 to 89. Served in various Naval Reserve units and in a variety of training assignments, and holds the Meritorious Service Medal, Bronze Star with Combat, and Presidential Unit Citation. Mr. Robert Shenk.
Good evening. I'm honored to be here, honored to have been asked to give this presentation. Of course, I know you're all much more familiar with the Pontos than I. Before I began this decade of research, I do not remember hearing of Trebizond, for example, though I have since noted reference to it in John Milton's Paradise Lost. And not long ago, I noticed reference to the Pontos in the first letter of Peter in the New Testament. To be sure, I had read Xenophon about the 10,000 fight to the sea, but since then, I have read a great deal about what was happening in the Pontos in the early 1920s. Reading typically from the American naval records, naval messages, naval war diaries, and so on. And so it seemed natural for me to entitle my talk, United States Navy in the Pontos. But as naval observers off any coast, as I myself have found, cannot tell much about what is taking place on that coast and inland from there unless someone tells them, my talk will reference reports of Native American relief workers and missionaries and even journalists, as well as naval officials. Finally, as you will hear, not all those obstructing things and keeping the truth hidden are those you might think they were. January 1919, Admiral Mark Bristol arrived in Constantinople to take charge of a small detachment of United States Navy ships. As the Great War receded, additional American naval vessels began arriving. Why, you might ask? As this audience is well aware, Americans everywhere in those days had been deeply moved by reports of terrible events that had taken place throughout Turkey during the war in what we now know as the Armenian Genocide. So deeply had the conscience of Americans been touched back then that, like many others, even I can remember my mother telling me to eat all my food because of the starving Armenians. And she was telling me this in the middle of Kansas in the 1950s, some 40 years after the events themselves, because of what she remembered hearing about so long before. Anyway, in 1919, American Near East relief teams made up of men and women both were scurrying to these little-known lands to do what they could to help those who had survived the death marches and massacres of 1915 to 1916. In these initial months, the Navy ships, mainly destroyers, smaller than cruisers but fast and highly efficient naval vessels nevertheless, carried relief workers and investigatory teams on the first leg of their journeys to ports throughout Anatolia. An American Army officer named Bostek spent 8 days investigating circumstances at and around Trebizond, riding there aboard the cruiser USS Olympia, a vessel famous for being the flagship of Commodore George Dewey during the Spanish-American War. This officer spoke of the great massacres, displacements, and death marches that had been inflicted during the Great War, not only upon the ethnic Armenians in Trebizond and in the surrounding region, but also upon many ethnic Greeks. He pointed out the Armenians had tended to suffer worse than the Greeks right there because they were further from the coast and thus more fully under Ottoman control. Besides formal governmental investigations on behalf of America, Admiral Bristol had the Navy ships do investigations of their own. The Admiral himself rode the armed yacht USS Nama to Samsun in March of 1919. In the region that Bristol visited, the Greek and Armenian villages had been practically wiped out, he said, and the villagers driven into the interior. The houses were burned and leveled to the ground. Only 10% of those villagers had returned, the Admiral wrote, and even those few had no houses to go to, no oxen or farm implements, and practically nothing with which to go to work in the field. Of all the cattle in the hands of the Turks, a great number had been stolen from the Greeks and Armenians. Finally, Bristol stated that although some refugee women and children were returning to Samsun, no great influx, he said, is expected because the people deported were taken too far inland. This statement might seem to indicate Bristol thought the deportees were just living elsewhere, perhaps in a more hospitable clime, as Turkish propagandists then claimed. However, Bristol at the time certainly knew of the horrors the minorities had suffered. For example, from Samsun, he wrote his wife a description of how at one spot nearby, Greek women and children were put first into the Turkish bath in midwinter and then driven into the country only half alive. These people died by the wayside of hunger and cold. This was the so-called White Death. Despite what he reported at the time, increasingly Admiral Bristol began to favor the Turks instead of their victims. The Admiral found it convenient to adopt a pro-Turkish slant, partly because of instructions from Admiral Sims in Paris in 1919 to safeguard American interests, which Bristol translated as America's business interests, and later because of the commercial agenda of the oncoming government of President Warren Harding and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. President Harding's emphases on promoting business and the open door were far removed from President Wilson's emphases on human rights and the rights of oppressed nations. Yet even Secretary of State Hughes's Near Eastern policies were to be influenced by the information provided him or kept from him by Admiral Bristol. On this promotion of American business, I should point out that in the Near East, Greek businessmen and Armenian businessmen often provided stiff competition for American business, whereas the Turks were not only the ruling officials whose favor was required in order to do any business in the region, but few Turks were businessmen themselves. So, the Americans who were bent on business and the admiral who was ever helping businessmen tend to cozy up to the ruling Turks. Although American officials under Bristol's direction ever professed America's neutrality, the admiral and many officers under his command regularly manifested a strong bias in favor of the Turks, at least until they saw what was happening on the ground. Of course, Navy people and businessmen were not the only Americans in the region. American Protestant missionaries had been carrying the word deep inland in Turkey for almost 100 years. And the missionaries worked primarily with the Armenians. Many of these missionaries had seen at first hand the atrocities inflicted upon all ethnic Christians during the Great War. As for the newly arriving relief workers, those who came to Marish Hajin, and other cities in the south of Turkey, that is in Cilicia, witnessed the beginnings of the Turkish Nationalist Revolution in early 1920 and saw newly enacted horrors themselves. Hence, they tended to hold opinions very different from the admiral. In 1919, there were 20 substantial American missionary stations and many smaller mission stations in Turkey, including schools, colleges, and hospitals at sites reaching from Armenia in the far eastern part of Turkey to Smyrna right on the Aegean Sea. And it was at these missions that the relief workers set up their operations. As they dived deeply into their relief work with orphans and other death march survivors, political and military events began to interrupt the initial period of peace. The British began to bow to pressure to bring their troops home. The French began to occupy south-central Turkey, or Cilicia, which secret treaties had assigned them during the war, and the Italians sent troops into Western Asia Minor bent on colonizing Western Turkey. To forestall the Italians, the Allied chiefs overseeing post-war events from Paris first sent many battleships to Smyrna, but then, against the advice of the captain of the USS Arizona, which was also there, they asked a Hellenic Greek army, an army from Greece itself, to occupy Smyrna on the Allies' behalf. They didn't want to use their own troops. It was a great mistake, partly because it inflamed Turkish feelings to have Greeks rule over them anywhere, and especially in Turkey proper, but also because the Greek premier Venizelos dreamed of an empire of Greater Greece. To include, he hoped, besides the nation of Greece itself, those parts of Turkey in which the Greeks had been living and thriving for millennia, including Smyrna and Ionia, yes, but also the Pontos. Hence, when Mustafa Kemal entered Turkey at Samsun on virtually the same day that the Greek army troops were disembarking at Smyrna, he found news of this embarrassment spreading like wildfire and inflaming Turks everywhere, and Turkey all of a sudden ripe for a revolution. Although Kemal was under British orders to put down Turkish disorder, he had other ideas and quickly took steps to offer himself as a nationalist leader for Turkey. Within months, Turkish forces began making noise not far from Constantinople itself. So the Allies, compounding their original mistake, because they were again utterly unwilling to use troops of their own, and part of the fault for many of the events that took place has to be given to the Allies in general. They asked the Greek army, whose commanders were quite willing, to advance north and east from the Smyrna region against those inconvenient Turks. Shortly, a war ensued between Hellenic Greeks and Turkish nationalists that was to last 2 years and end catastrophically, both for Hellenic Greeks and for the ethnic Greeks alike, including those about whom we gather tonight, the Greeks of the Pontos. So we have a war beginning between two armies in the far western part of Turkey, American relief being provided to suffering ethnic Armenians, ethnic Greeks, and even to suffering Turks at American mission stations throughout the Turkish subcontinent. American businessmen beginning to ply their wares throughout the Near East region with Admiral Bristol's strong support. The businessmen even were allowed to ride the American destroyers from port to port, a highly unusual policy. And the American, I never saw it. And the American Navy ships steaming here and there throughout the Black Sea, Aegean, and Eastern Mediterranean. American naval detachment typically consisted of 4, 6, or 8 destroyers at a time. Glimpsing the importance of Mustafa Kemal early on, Admiral Bristol began stationing a destroyer at Samsun, for it seemed the easiest way to get to and hear of the nationalists at Angora, who Bristol began unofficially to befriend. American ships soon had their work on hands in the northern part of the Black Sea as well. For example, from 1921 to 1923, the Hoover grain ships were being sent from America to help end a terrible Russian famine in all of southern Russia, which they in fact succeeded in doing. And a series of American destroyers were sent to Russian ports to help coordinate this massive enterprise. Hence, eventually, there were American destroyers sent on a kind of rotating schedule clockwise throughout the Black Sea, with ships stationed 2 or 3 weeks apiece at Odessa, then Novorossiysk, then Batum at the far eastern end of the Black Sea, then to Trebizond, then to Samsun, and back to Constantinople. Having deployed his destroyers in such a fashion, the admiral was regularly informed of many events taking place inland in Turkey. Besides the American missionaries and relief workers who were connected by telegraph wires to the coast, the destroyer captains could communicate with Turkish and European officials and American businessmen at Trebizond and Samsun, and they could also send emissaries to Angora, modern Ankara, as Bristol often did. The Bristol regularly had a trade attaché at Angora, where Bristol was insistent upon continuing to do business even while the death marches were taking place just 50 or 100 miles away from there. Beyond that, whenever an American returned from a mainland site in Turkey, the admiral invited that person to see him, and his war diaries for 4 years are filled with the details of these conversations. And then at the port of Samsun, the destroyer captains, there was always a destroyer there, for 2 years, kept a series of war diaries running to several pages per day on what was happening in that port and at ports inland in Turkey. In such a way, a naval captain whose destroyer was newly reporting to the port could read back over months, even years of diaries to help him understand events, personalities, and the general situation in Samsun, the nearby region, and further inland in Turkey, as far as that was possible to know. And so too in our day, by reading the Admiral's war diaries in the extensive Bristol papers in the Library of Congress, by reading the ship's captains' diaries, for some ship captains kept their own ship's diaries, and their sons or sons-in-laws gave copies to me, and by reading reports of American missionaries and relief workers from throughout the Pontos and far inland from there, now to be found in the National Archives, one is able to figure out much about what was taking place then, or at least to add to others' accounts of these events, accounts by men and women of many nationalities and backgrounds, for of course not only contemporary official reports, but letters, diaries, and even full-length memoirs, not least the very moving, wonderful biography of her mother by Pia Halo, have appeared. To start with, Mustafa Kemal began organizing the Turks to fight off Allied and Greek incursions. In January of 1920, he began the Turkish Nationalist Revolution by directing the Turks to fight off the French, who were attempting to colonize Cilicia in the south-central part of Turkey, so that the French eventually turned tail and left.